You see, you've joined us. We can start now. No, I'm fine. Are we on?
Yeah.
We're broadcasting. Well, welcome everyone to the Columbia Justice Lab series on research and justice policy. As is our tradition, we meet in a different room every time we get together. In this speaker series, we are exploring the relationship between research and policy. And we've been asking each of our distinguished speakers each month to address the theme of how research can help make the public policy response to crime more effective in contributing to community safety, fairer, and radically less punitive. We're very grateful to the support of Columbia's faculty for Arts and Science and the former Columbia Dean Fred Harris for making this series possible. A couple of notes on format. As a Zoom webinar, audience members are muted with their videos turned off. I'm here today at the Columbia Justice Lab with Monica Bell and the rest of our lab staff, students and affiliates. We're reserving some time at the end of the hour to respond to audience questions. If you're on Zoom, use the Q&A feature to pose questions at any time throughout the discussion. Our online moderator, Sam, will select questions for Monica to address after this presentation. Sam, do you want to say what?
I think I'm good, but
okay.
Yeah.
In-person questions are also welcome from the room. If you have any technical questions, feel free to ask in the Q&A. So we're really lucky today to be able to welcome Monica Bell to the Justice Lab. Monica is a professor of law at Yale University. Her research examines the intersections between community life, race and poverty, violence and policing, social policy. She's done really pioneering work on the idea of legal estrangement. And that describes, in the way I read it, the practical understanding of community residents of their relationship to police and other authorities. There's really a critical engagement with research on community trust and the legitimacy of law enforcement, but brilliantly, I think, and this really characterizes a lot of Monica's work, she incorporates sociological ideas about social structural inequality in people's practical understandings. Monica's research has been widely published and lauded in leading law reviews and sociology journals, including the Yale Law Journal, the NYU Law Review, and the American Journal of Sociology. Her talk today is called The Surveillance and Fragility of Black Motherhood. Thanks very much, Monica.
Thanks. Thank you for having me. I'm really, really excited to be in conversation with you today. And I especially want to thank Bruce and Julie, Sam, and Paulette for getting me here and organizing all of this. So just
Sorry.
Oh, no problem.
Want to share the slides?
Happy to do so. Great. I actually tweaked for the purposes of this presentation, the title. So hopefully you're seeing the slides now. I'm presenting pieces of a somewhat unusual project I've been working on in some form for about 4 years now. And I welcome all and even harsh feedback. I'm happy for someone to say, I think this is ridiculous. Most of the pieces I'm going to present today focus on family surveillance, particularly like what people tend to call child protective services, or more recently names like family discipline or family policing. But the work is broader in its scope as well. So I'm going to start with the first piece. I've heard stories about people who have lost their children. I was in high school. They would say, so-and-so got our kids taken because her house was too dirty. I was scared to death. I've heard of people that if your house isn't clean and they come in there and your house is really filthy, they would take your kids. How filthy do your house have to be? I'm not the neatest person. My house is comfortable. How dirty does your house have to be for them to take your kids? When they said dirty, what do they mean? When I look at hoarders, I don't know if you know hoarders, I was thinking, this must be what they mean? Because I would think if they saw a pile of dirty clothes or whatever, I wouldn't think they would say, I'm going to take your daughter. How dirty does your house have to be? So I'll just stay there actually. So this is a piece from this broader project that I'm calling empirical poetry. So these are the words of mothers who I interviewed in Washington, DC. I'm gonna say a little bit more about the methodology before, but just to pull out some of the things from the piece. One thing that's important about this piece is that the mother who is speaking here had not been investigated by Child Protective Services herself. What she's describing instead of the actual harm of investigation is instead a constant nagging fear that I've seen over and over again thematically in many cities at this point where I've interviewed Black women with children. And the point here in some ways is to reveal how carceral surveillance structures daily life in the most mundane of ways, not necessarily the kind of sensational ways that we tend to think about and talk about in the context of the carceral system. And what really I think you see here is a sense of almost existential dread about things like, how clean your house is. And just to say this here, because I actually haven't planned to say it elsewhere, all the repetition in these pieces are repetitions from the person who said them. So they're not imposed by me. And I just think that's important to underscore. So to say a bit more about this population, what I'm doing in this particular project, I'm collecting new data, I promise, but I'm here revisiting old data to which I don't think I have done justice. 10 years ago, more than 10 years ago at this point, I conducted 50 in-depth semi-structured interviews in Washington, DC, which is one of my favorite cities, with low-income Black mothers. And to qualify to be in the study, the mothers just had to have children under the age of 18, either custodial or biological. And they had to be living in some form of publicly subsidized housing. So a couple of pieces I just think is important to highlight, and I've highlighted on the slide. More than half of the mothers are receiving TANF. Now, this was at a particular policy point in DC where the kind of national 5-year TANF limit wasn't quite in effect. It was, but it wasn't. It's complicated. And so I imagine that number will be lower now. 90%, so 45 were receiving SNAP. A couple of important points here. More than half of them had been arrested. And this is something I was able to check using public records, but also more than half had been investigated by child services. And importantly, I'm underscoring here that this is self-report. Like I couldn't check records for that. So these are just people who were telling me about it. And then of course, the piece that I started with was a mother who had not been. So again, just kind of underscoring the pervasiveness of that particular system amongst population. So I'm gonna keep going. Just to say a little bit more about the empirical puzzle that initially motivated this study was really, I was broadly interested in Black mothers' experiences with legal authorities in various ways. So I asked a lot of different types of questions, and this is actually how I came to studying policing in the first place, because I didn't head in with the goal of doing that. Just, by way of autobiography, I had been a legal aid lawyer in DC the year before I started this project. And so, and I was working primarily on welfare and child support policy, so not policing, but it comes up, it turns out. But particularly with this project, as I said, I felt like I hadn't done justice to these interviews, despite writing multiple pieces with them that are were traditionally sociological. And what I wanted to get to is how I could better convey the complexity, ambivalence, and emotional immediacy of this set of experiences. And even more specifically in this project, and you can tell me whether this is effective or not, because I'm going to read pieces and talk about them. But one of the things I want to try to do is to think about if we as researchers can rely solely on the voices of respondents, of when trying to make key empirical and theoretical arguments. And so I think what I've tried to do here is to achieve that as best as possible, even though I am going to pull out themes a bit when I talk about the pieces. Just to say a little bit more about the methodology before I head back into the pieces, and like why do this, like why try this? So in terms of my own experience writing with qualitative data, there are a couple of issues that tend to come up repeatedly. One is we often, especially in the context of articles, do not necessarily have to do this with books. With articles, we tend to flatten how we describe subjects. Like, so, a 44-year-old Black mother of 3 or something is like the descriptor that we offer of people, and then some quote. And that, I think, is a quite flat way of thinking about people. And I'm going to connect this all back up to the provocation that Bruce asked us to get into, which is like, the effects on policy and like, why is this important for kind of narrative shifting? And for me, part of it is like, that's a flattening that I think is unhelpful in the process of revealing the complexity and kind of human costs of these systems. Also, we tend to flatten data in a few different ways. I mean, we pull out quotes and we have full field notes. If you, and I'll say, I mean, even by way of, I want to move through this quickly because I want to get back to pieces, but how I started trying to work in this way was because I was struggling to find an appropriate block quote to, it was like, how can I get, there's this really complex story that is playing out across 2 interviews. And I was working on this project and I just couldn't do it. Like it was like not possible to do what I wanted to do to get to all the relevant parts of the interview. And we know that if you put a huge block quote or a big chunk of field notes in something, only the most diligent of readers is actually going to read it. People usually skip over that, like if we're honest. And second, just to say just a quick bit more, one thing I hope this project also does, even though the words are solely from the respondents, there's something about poetry, I think we understand that whoever is curating it is mixing their labor with it in some way. And I think often when we just have quotes, we usually leave out, of course, the questions that we ask. And even if we don't, the reader doesn't get a sense of the emotional landscape that was happening in the context of the interview. And so what I'm hoping this form does also is elevate the fact that this knowledge building is an intersubjective process as well. So there's a lot of interpretive work that goes into picking which pieces of words and how it's going to be arranged on the page that I hope is revealed. And then finally, about the methodology, and I'm going to go quickly here. So in terms of the process of working on these, there's 2 layers of coding that have been happening. One is an empirical form of coding. So that kind of traditional qualitative coding, looking for themes, being selective, looking for negative cases, et cetera. If you've done qualitative research, you know about this already. But the second layer that I've spent a lot of time doing is what I've been calling poetic coding. And the big theme, instead of coding for frequency and salience, what I've been trying to do is code for the emotional resonance of what's happening to the person, what the person's describing. So coding for the story and also coding for complexities within stories. Instead of using multiple coders, I've been doing this myself. I actually imagine, I don't know that that's necessary. There's a question mark there, but source of conversation. And also coding for things that are unexpected. And I think that's another way of thinking about negative cases, I think, in some ways. And then also there's a lot of experimentation that is continuing to play out with this project. But I hope that is explanatory of the methodology. Okay. All right. So I'm going to read some more pieces. I was spoiled until I lost my mother. I was 27. I lost my mother. A month later, I lost my kids. They was called on me. They was called on me and my kids was taken. My aunt did it. I shut down. When they took my kids, I started giving up on life, withdrawn, selling drugs, doing drugs. It took me on a downfall. Have you forgiven your aunt? In the last 5 years, I have. At first, I couldn't. It made my kids hard. They was out my life. I was seeing them, but I didn't have them. Right now, I'm working on a relationship with my oldest. She's disrespectful. She called me a bitch, told me I was dead to her. Right now, I'm working on a relationship with my middle. I don't know where she's at. I have one brother, but I don't have him. I just lost him too. How long ago? To be honest, I don't want to know. I can't remember. I've been losing so many people. I try not to remember. I just lost my father the other night. I try not to remember. Since I lost my father, my mind is just, it's been drifting because I've been losing people so much. I feel so numb right now. I don't know what to feel. So hope what comes through in this piece are really the deep emotional effects of loss and the kind of cascading effects of CPS involvement specifically, and the trauma that emerges from these experiences. I think so often, even now when people are increasingly critical of systems of family policing, we don't get this kind of sense of like this deep trauma, the sense of loss, the numbness, like what actually happens to people in a deeper way because of experiencing these types of carceral systems. So I hope that's underscored here. If I told somebody about her father picking her up and throwing her back down, they might go back and tell somebody in social services. They might misinterpret that as something that happened recently. That was something that happened when she was 5 months old. She's 5 years old now. They would misinterpret. Then I'd have cops at my house. I'm trying to convince them that it happened at blah, blah, blah. They're not listening. They probably wouldn't listen to me because of the situation that I'm in. Welfare, public housing. I don't think they would believe me. They would look at me in disbelief. I don't think they would believe me. They wouldn't believe me. I know one lady, she had gotten arrested for something that happened to her years ago. It cost her a job. It cost her headaches. An arrest that had nothing to do with the present. You be careful about who you're telling this stuff to. They can go back and tell on you. So I hope us coming through in this piece, I think there are 3 themes I want to underscore. One is the discrediting effect of poverty and benefit receipt. And we know that these systems have a discrediting effect, but what I think is important here is that this mother also knows this and it structures her behavior in important ways. So it's recognized, and so that really structures how she thinks about these systems altogether. So even like this idea of legal estrangement, what are the contours of it? This is one of them, like knowing that these systems discredit you. Also seeing the police here as an arbitrary force, and in the criminal legal system as kind of arbitrarily invoked and invited, even while recognizing that her daughter had suffered a particular kind of trauma. And then third, this kind of carefulness about tattling. So when I hear like this, especially this last bit about how somebody can go back and tell on you, it's almost like the state is a disciplinary parent, right? Like that invites a certain type of relationship to the state, one of not just humiliation, but just kind of like an infantilizing effect. And then this mother who's a full-grown woman who's really deep and thoughtful is aware. It's like walking through life with this awareness. And I just think that's an important effect of the system to highlight. I was in love. We did everything together. I got locked up. We was together for 3 years, but we wasn't even married but a year before I got locked up. Then when I got locked up and I came home, he was in. He just came home last year. We wasn't together for over 5 years because he was locked up. We just got a divorce last year. It wasn't even really a marriage. So obviously we see here themes about how punishment breaks up loving relationships. But I think one thing I think is interesting here is this is specifically a marriage. You know, this is someone who was trying to do this kind of traditional blessed thing, like being in love and getting married and building a life together. But we see in a really stark way how these really short stints of incarceration for pretty, I mean, they were just kind of, and they were just kind of in and out, back and forth, but and they just couldn't align their times together with these short stints of incarceration, and it ruins this marriage that she was, really happy to be a part of and happy to be living this kind of traditional blessed experience. One thing I just wanted to point out that I tried to do here was I try in all the pieces to have a particular sort of layout on the page, but what I was trying to convey with this one, we see the language locked up at many points across the page. And it kind of trails off over the page. And the point is to really elevate how incarceration, and especially short stints like this, are really a kind of abstract flowing phenomenon that kind of splays out in a way that that ultimately fractures this loving relationship that we start with in kind of a more solid form. So that's what the form is meant to convey. Somebody at the school called CPS on me. They talked to my daughter. They said, "We apologize, but we had to come out. Somebody called. We talked to your daughter. She assured us she's not being abused. It happened in the school. I don't whoop mine, but sometimes if I feel I need to knock the crap out of you, I'm going to knock the crap out of you." She let the police know that. This one day, I picked her up. They said she was running up and down the halls, doing what she wanted to do. I said, "Didn't I tell you not to act up today?" I smacked her. She hit my hand. I grabbed her, slammed her on the table. The teacher called CPS. It was one of the teachers. I thought she was a friend of mine. I don't got nothing to say to her no more. I stopped going to her class. I used to go down to school and volunteer, help out with the kids, explain to them we're here for a reason. I stopped doing all that in her class. Why should I come in here and help you? You went behind my back and called CPS on me. Never say nothing to her again. So this piece obviously involves, a teacher calling CPS on a mother. And it's not really clear whether this was per se not what she was supposed to do, right? So, but at the same time, the mother who was talking to me really experienced this as a deep betrayal. And so like one theme is that this kind of deep sense of betrayal that emerges out of the calling process. And often, as we saw in the earlier piece, conversation about an aunt, we see conversations about family members all the time in CPS, this time as a teacher. And teachers, because of public policy, are mandatory reporters of suspected abuse and neglect. And so when I think about this story from the teacher's perspective, she might have felt it was necessary to call because of what this respondent, pseudonym Janice, what she described. And so what I really think is important to underscore here is the corrosive effect for everyone involved. We see her articulating a reduced desire to be involved in her kids' schooling, which is certainly a negative effect when you actually do have a parent who wants to be involved in school. And in some ways, this is I think this demonstrates the sense of betrayal by the teacher, by the school, is really the heights of estrangement in some ways. So when I was right about legal estrangement, this is, I think, a primary example of how this actually plays out, because what's happened here is this person, what these policies do is turn people who should be sources of support into threats, right? Like, so the teacher should be a source of support. This is supposed, this is supposed to be really a liberatory system. But what does it mean when our schools have these carceral effects because of policies that we've adopted, and for ostensibly good reasons? Okay. Next. Well, my name is such and such, and I'm coming here from CPS. We got a report of neglect. Neglect of who? I don't neglect my kids. Y'all got the wrong person. Oh my God, just leave me alone. Oh my God, what could he want? What did I do? This boy called CPS on me, this random boy. I wouldn't talk to him. He used to walk past with a little smirk on his face, laughing and stuff. I was like, I bet you he called on me. And he called. The man had come to my house to the kids' school. He was like, someone called. I asked, tell me if it was a male or a female. He told me it wasn't a female. The man came and went to the kids' school. He talked to the teachers. He talked to the principal. He talked to the kids. He came to my house, got to see the house. He said it was no compliance with what the person had said. He was sorry, but he gave me a referral. I went to get furniture. They paid for my whole place. I got furniture there. Living room, dining room, bedroom. Everybody got new everything. We had to go to a center. We give them a little paper. They give us clothes and everything. We got all new furniture. Even though it was bad that he called, it benefited us in the long run. I don't know. So a few points to underscore here. One of the things I think is most interesting about this piece is her reasoning. I'll just even go back to that, the first slide. So when she's talking about how this boy called CPS on her, and she's like, oh, it's because, I wouldn't talk to him, and he looked at me and smirked, and she's like, well, clearly, it must be him, clearly. A CPS report could come from anywhere. She doesn't know. It's like, she doesn't actually know that this person was the source of this call. It could really come from anywhere. And I think this underscores in some ways what I've written about in some other settings about how the condition of poverty and overlaid with certain types of policies, including this one, erode trust in a much broader way than we tend to think about and articulate as being a consequence of the carceral system, which is that, like, it makes everyone, like even someone who's not a mandatory reporter, like this boy, a potential threat to her, but she doesn't really know. It could be literally anyone. But she was trying to make sense of this caller in a way that did not make her feel illegitimate or like justifiably suspicious, right? So instead it's like, oh, because I wouldn't talk to him, like, or I wouldn't accept his interest. This piece underscores also, and this is what, he's the man, he talks to the teachers, he, looks inside the house. So many of the pieces about CPS talk about this invasiveness of the investigation. This is actually not in this piece, but in other pieces. There's a lot of, they went through the fridge to see if there was good food in there. And we understand why this is part of the process. But and also for these mothers, it's a particularly invasive form of investigation that makes them feel just under a level of surveillance, even thinking about to the dirty house piece, that none of us would want to subject ourselves to. I mean, it's like, I don't want anyone to look through my fridge and see just the crap I have in there, or certainly not to investigate my house for cleanliness, but this is a daily kind of concern in this context. But of course, another theme here that's important to underscore is the complexity. So I think a lot of work about child and family services has been either explanatory and justificatory, and increasingly critical. And I would label this project as also critical. It's also in a critical bent. But then there's also this fact that she apparently didn't have furniture that was very nice, or a lot of it. And there were a lot of benefits that came to her family, including nice, safe furniture, new clothes, all of these things that benefited her family. And she was happy to have that. And so she was not happy for the investigation. Like, that's not the claim. I think we see this, this is a theme that I've written about in the context of city municipal policing as well, where people might acknowledge that there's some benefit that they receive from this involvement, but that doesn't mean they want the involvement. And so that, I think, is underscored here, that complexity of engagement with these systems. And there's a final piece I'm going to read, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about the policy link and why I care about it. It's the last piece. I called child services myself for my son. I realized I was an addict and needed help. I got evicted from my apartment. That was when I felt like I had hit bottom. I called them. I let them know me and my son had been evicted. I didn't want him to be out on the streets. So this short piece is unusual. So when I talked about coding for negative cases earlier, this is an outlier. This is a negative case. This is the only time I have heard tell of someone calling child services proactively because they needed help. It's always been a more top-down, someone else reporting on the investigation story. And as far as I can tell, it doesn't show up much in the literature. And so I include this because it demonstrates two things I think are important to underscore. One is the utter desperation that this occurs in, right? So, and there's more to say about this respondent and her long-term relationship with her son, who was an adult. So he wasn't actually the focal child in this study. As an adult by the time I did this interview. But his involvement with child services and everything that was going on with her really damaged their relationship over the long term. And they had an intense relationship. They were in each other's life, but it was very fraught in some of the similar ways that you saw in the earlier piece about this kind of long-term trauma of being involved in child services. But out of utter desperation, this is who she could call. This is who we have available. This is what it is. And so it makes us wonder. I think it should make us ask if there's a better way to deliver these sorts of services without having to have full-on removal of children from mothers' lives. And I think that has been more the model that at least some agencies have tried to change to. But there's a question about the kind of fundamental punitiveness and carcerality of these systems. But the second thing I wanted to underscore, there's a reason why so many of the pieces so many of the lines in the poem start with I. And that's because as we were sitting together, when we were doing this interview, this is a moment in which she actually was kind of proud of herself as a mother. There was a way in which she articulated this choice to call child services as an agentic one. It was not, she didn't see it as like, well, I'm in such a pathetic situation that, well, I don't know. I mean, she said she was in a bad situation, but she viewed this and her retroactive articulation of it as something she did that was good. And I just think that's important to highlight the complexity of navigating, like the choice to involve oneself selectively in these systems under circumstances of desperation. There are still choices that people make there's still choices that people make, and I think it's important to highlight that. So my last couple of minutes of talking, I want to say a little bit more about what, if anything, you can disagree, what poetry has to do with justice policy, and kind of why I've decided to keep working on this, although there have been in fits and starts. So I'm really inspired by Audre Lorde in many ways, and her essay, Poetry is Not a Luxury, 1977, I think underscores some of the reasons for here. And I'm not going to read this slide, but I just want to point out some of the highlights here, and I'll say a little bit more about each in a second. But, Lorde talks about how poetry is about distilling experience. And in this project, I'm not distilling my own experience, which is typically what people are doing with poetry, but instead distilling the experiences of people I've interviewed in a social scientific sense. But it's not just about wordplay. You can, the style here is very narrative. The point is for them to be understandable. They're not flowery language. They're the language that has been given. But I hope that, so it's like in terms of the goals are more to really distill that experience and reveal it. But I also think, and Lorde talks about here, the relationship between language and poetry and ideas and then tangible action. So for her, there's a clear link into what people do from poetry. And here also just, she says, poetry coins a language to express and charter this revolutionary awareness and demand, the implementation of that freedom. So what it means to acquire freedom is both to have language for it on a macro level, but also on a micro level, like how people articulate their own experiences is a way of living freely. One other thing, and this is a strange bit for academia. I'm actually just I'm gonna skip to these, just in the interest of time. So you should have seen in those previous two slides bits that I highlighted, and here in this last slide, I wanted to pull out some kind of takeaways from what Lorde is saying about this link between that. I think there's a link between poetry and policy. One, articulating experience in a palpable way. So the hope is that the reader not only gains information, but feels the information. Second, this point about moving from language to idea to action. So I think there's something powerful about poetry in the sense that it connects all of those three. Third, expressing these revolutionary demands in ways that actually implement freedom. So this, I would not call sitting through an interview freedom, but one of the things I will say is that so many times, especially in these interviews, the experience after the interview was that these mothers, by and large, they ended with hugs. People were happy for their stories to be heard by someone. And while on some level, I think it would be better to have them actually writing the poems or something like that. Like, I think that there's a better version of this probably. But even in telling one story, freedom emerges, like a form of freedom emerges from that I think is important when we think about moving towards changes in public policy. Fourth, recognizing the importance of new articulations, not necessarily new ideas. And this is the point I think is challenging for academics. I mean, even I have to say, like, this legal estrangement idea that really undergirds a lot of what I'm trying to do in this project, but that's not a new idea. Right? Like, that's, it's a new term, but I think so often, I think especially in a lot of the experiences of communities in the face of the carceral system, we're kind of learning the same things over and over again. It's like, I don't know that actually what we need is a new theory of X, but new articulations, which I think poetry invites us to do, they're particularly important when thinking about moving forward on policy change. We also saw Lorde talking about the importance of heretical ideas and heretical actions. And especially for me as someone who, it's like my bread and butter is traditional qualitative sociology and legal scholarship. And I think there's a way in which, because the form of poetry invites us to play and to be creative, it very much ties into some of the work about imagination. We think about abolition and this relationship to imagination. I think poetry is part of that type of project that invites us to imagine more broadly about what the system should look like. And then finally, I think the relationship between poetry and justice policy involves fighting oppressive structures while retaining a sense of the human. The point here is that, we're caught up in these systems. And I think so often we lose sight of how these systems are deeply experienced. We might get it's like, we'll say, oh, yeah, sure, they're bad. And we'll say they're bad in particular ways. But one of the things I hope comes through in the poems is things like existential dread, things like the mundanity of the experience. Emotions like betrayal as being important for understanding the actual harms of the system in terms of how people are able to live their lives. I'll stop there, but I'm really grateful for your listening.
Let's see. So, that was fantastic, Monica. I've got like a million questions, but why don't we first turn to the room and see if we have questions in the room, and then we'll look online. Okay, I'm gonna take this.
Asleep.
Sam, I'm just gonna
No,
jump in.
it's like-
Go on.
So when you're pulling this quote,
Sam,
are
if you
you,
could just speak up
Okay,
just for
all right.
everyone.
okay, when the quotes and the poems that we saw,
Mhm.
are you imposing anything besides kind of like the way that they're structured on the page? Are you like editing, are the quotes being edited, or you're just like changing the way the line breaks are happening? And
Oh, the quotes are being edited.
okay,
Yeah. So in terms of the rules, like,
Yeah.
so the rules are like, I don't repeat anything, so there are no artificial repetitions. But yeah, so the quotes are not heavily edited. But yeah, it's more than just line breaks.
Okay.
It's more than just line breaks.
and is the chronology remaining the same?
No.
Okay,
That has changed. So when I actually started working on this, I was like, well, I shouldn't change the chronology. But then I decided that actually maybe it made sense sometimes to change chronology, and in part, so you might start off with a theme at the beginning of the interview, and then like it comes back in at the end, but actually to convey like what's actually like happening, it makes more sense to rearrange them. So basically, as I've written more of these, the rules have come into sharper relief. Because I think for me, the main commitment is to try to convey the actual kind of emotionality of what is being told to me. And that's what I'm trying to have the most fidelity to, instead of like,
Yeah.
I don't know, an arbitrary rule.
so yeah, I thought it was so effective, and also like, when we translate qualitative interviews into text, it's like when we have conversations, things are not happening linearly, and the way that
Right.
we're communicating is like totally like, but we're making sense of it in real time. And that kind of doesn't and when you try to coerce that kind of interview conversation into paper, it feels almost like less natural than what you did. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I
Yeah.
totally do. I totally know. Like, is in fact, like that's how it started. Like, I'm not someone who had a previous interest in writing poems.
Mhm.
Actually, this arose totally organically from trying to write a paper and running and bumping into this problem.
Yeah, you're remembering, oh, this is the way the conversation felt, but when I'm writing, it's like totally.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, great, really, really cool.
Okay, I'm going to jump in and ask my question, then we'll go online. I thought this was really interesting and provocative in a whole variety of ways. In a number of projects that we're working on here at the lab, we're thinking a lot about narrative change and how through our work in different ways, we can shift public conversations and language and conceptual frameworks and so on. And I would love to sort of think through the implications of this work for narrative change. When we were rolling out the National Academy's report on high incarceration rates in 2014, and that report, in a very quantitative way, documented all sorts of disparities and inequalities associated with incarceration. Right before we published that report, Jennifer Eberhardt, I think it was, published a paper that described how readers, when presented with statistics on racial disparity in the criminal justice system, that would harden criminal stigma and reinforced racial stereotypes about Black criminality. And we're like thrown into a panic when this paper came out, because the last thing we wanted to do was to have that kind of effect, as we were talking about all of the disparities in the system. So I'm trying to think about the connection of this type of work to how readers can receive it. And this is like radically different. This is like hyper qualitative, because it is zeroing in on fragments of human experience and the deep emotional resonance of those fragments. Are you thinking that in describing this deep emotional experience of the people that you're talking to, and perhaps making a deep emotional connection with readers, that this could possibly be anti-racist in a way that say the National Academy's report could not be in its presentation of statistics? Readers are still going to bring all of their stereotypical views and human experience to these very powerful fragments too. And when people talk about system involvement and system contact and so on, will all of that be interpreted through that lens? And how do you think about those sorts of issues?
So a big part of the motivation actually is precisely the type of anti-racist work that you were identifying. So the mission is so that readers kind of, again, not just read some quotes, but like read them and feel them. Like, and the mission there is to connect people who may or may not have any experiences in common with these mothers. I think you can see their reasoning. Like, I think it feels different when you read about a mother being afraid, like who's talking about watching Hoarders and not wanting to be like, is that, trying to figure out the right bar, or all of these things. Like, I think there is, the word humanizing is controversial, but I do think there's like a connection to the human experience in a way that is unassailable. And that's what I'm trying to tap into. But at the same time, there's some risk in that. And this is what you're coming to in the second part of your question. There's a lot of different risks. But one of just kind of leaving the words and leaving the complexity and people talking about, like the example, the love poem that is actually about like getting a divorce because of incarceration, one could read that and react, well, maybe y'all shouldn't have been doing whatever was like getting y'all caught up in these short stints. Like I'm well aware that that could be a reaction that someone could have from reading this. But there is a way, and this is a thing I've been learning from poets as I've continued to work on this project. As a social scientist, and especially as a legal scholars are even more about controlling the interpretation of the material we present. Because there is risk of just putting out decontextualized information. I'm hoping that in the curation and in kind of pulling out some of the themes, at least in the talks and the larger project, I'm not sure exactly, but I'm kind of leaning against doing that. There's a way in which you're inviting, the reader has to be trusted on some level. And I think you don't want to stand in the way of having that connective experience. So anyway, those are some of the things I'm thinking about. Like I view this as an anti-racist project that is one that is challenging for various reasons. I know there are questions, so I want to ask you.
Yeah, we got a bunch online.
Yeah. So there were a couple of people, and I think this question links up nicely with how you ended your presentation. A couple of people asked if you've shared the work with your respondents or given any of the sort of original participants from 10 years ago, sort of a window or an avenue for like continuing to be involved.
Yeah, so I can't. So this project has had many ups, downs, and upheavals. And one of the reasons I almost didn't do it, didn't continue it, is because I can't do that for IRB reasons. I know where people are from. I've kept track of people. I can obviously go and like kind of share this with community. I've presented this work in more kind of community facing spaces, but not with the exact people because I can't for IRB reasons that I did not anticipate when I started collecting these data. So that's like a warning to graduate students. Be careful how you structure your IRB projects. But I'll say this, like I said, I've presented this in more kind of community-based settings. The reason I've pressed on with this, despite its imperfections in terms of like my ability to be like, hey, this is what I've done. You know, this is how I've restructured your story. What do you think about this? I can't do that. But the reason I've pressed on with it is because when I have presented this work in front of audiences that are more similar to the respondents, the emotional reaction to seeing these stories set out in this way has been quite profound. People have told me things like they felt seen, like this has happened over and it's like I felt seen by reading here and hearing this in this way, and this like was compelling and powerful to them. I presented an earlier version of this work in a prison with like in a teaching setting, and like it's a similar kind of reaction, and like that motivates me more. That despite the imperfections, I'm like, okay, well maybe I should keep working on it.
If there's anyone in the room.
Yeah, if there's
okay.
questions in the room to just indicate that we have a million questions online.
All right. There are also a couple of people asking about who you imagine your audience to be for this one.
Yeah, well, that's a good question. There are sometimes that I present this where I de-emphasize all the stuff I told you at the beginning about the methods, because but for a social science audience, I thought maybe it's like just provocative, like method stuff. I don't know who the right audience is. I think this is important. Like, I'd be happy to take feedback, actually. Shoot me an email with who you think would be interested in this. I don't know, but I do think it's, I think anyone who is interested in learning more about these experiences in a way that will connect them to it humanistically and deeply, as opposed to merely intellectually. I think that could include academic audiences, but it need not be solely that. There are a few more minutes. I'm trying to be brief, but I'm like, maybe I should be long-winded. I don't know. I don't know.
Can I ask you another question along these lines? I feel like I've been in a lot of rooms over the last year, but probably longer, in which the emotional tenor of the meeting and where the participants are at in their own emotional sort of place is being seen as very important to the politics of justice work right now, and yes, and so people are reflecting a lot on sort of where they are in a mental emotional sort of way, and that feels somewhat different to me than pre-COVID,
Yeah,
for
totally.
example.
Yeah.
And so at least, probably not so much in academic rooms, but in other kinds of rooms where people are focused on problems of
Right.
political change, there seems to be this openness and appetite for investigating, the emotional resonance of difficult human experience in connection with justice. I don't know if there is an observation that seems connected to your work. I can't quite formulate a question, but
No, so I've also noticed this, and I think it's a great thing. And it's funny because I've actually chalked that up. Maybe we can. I think chalking it up to COVID seems, at least in part, right. I also think it's generational. I think that
yeah,
I think that younger people have changed the workplace in ways that like invite us to situate ourselves in that way, and I think that's a healthy thing. I think that's great. But I mean, I hadn't actually thought about that phenomenon in relationship to this project, but I do think that, it's complicated because I think logic and statistics are really, really important. I don't see them as, I don't know, maybe actually what you're making me think is that when we're in those rooms, starting from the place of like, this is how I'm feeling, so y'all should just know that. So let's like start there. And then we are also doing complicated thinking around justice policy from a logical standpoint. It actually reinforces the fact that like logos and pathos are deeply intertwined. That's actually what I'm trying to get at with the empirical poetry project, because it's a poetry project, but it is empirical. Like there's coding and there are themes. And that I think is part of the provocation as well. And so while I hadn't thought about those in relationship to each other, like maybe it is like on trend in that sense.
I guess to just finish up, we've had a few people ask about whether you've presented this presentation or this work to CPS. And if you see sort of direct connections between the empirical poetry and sort of material change in people's lives.
Yeah, so I have not. That's a good idea. So I should say, in terms of where are we in this project? I've been working on it for a long time, but I've not been presenting it very much at all. Like, so I'm still building up that, in part because I'm like, is this a legitimate project? I'm still at that question mark stage. But if it is a legitimate project, I would love to present this work to people in government agencies, because I have actually, I will say this, I've presented to teachers actually, and that was fascinating. I spent a lot more, like, trying to understand, and they, I think, felt like this was helpful for them in terms of thinking about some of the parents they work with. So these are urban educators and kind of like kind of professional education setting, though they were getting extra training. And I think they felt it was helpful, but there wouldn't have been any direct policy changes that would have flowed from that. But like, I do really like that idea, I guess is where I'll end there. And hopefully I'll have a chance to do that one day.
great. Well, unfortunately, our time has come for today. Man, I could continue this conversation all afternoon. So please join me in thanking Monica for a brilliant presentation. Our next talk will be in the new year on February 12th at noon. We'll hear from Professor Charles Lee in the School of Social Work at Columbia. And I hope everyone has a happy holiday and a successful end to the term and a restorative time before we reconvene again in February. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.